Hello and welcome to the Walter Scott Prize Shortlist Spotlight. I'm Sheila Averbuck, the social media manager for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. Thank you so much for all of you who are joining us live this evening. Please do leave a message in the comments. Tell us where you're joining from. Let us know if you have any questions for this week's guest. I am thrilled to introduce author Maggie O'Farrell, best-selling, award-winning author. She has won prizes including the Somerset Mom Award, the Costa Novel Award, the Women's Prize for Fiction, and she has now been shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for this beautiful, beautiful book, Hamnet. Maggie, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here, Sheila.
Congratulations on being the #1 bestseller in the UK. That is a huge honor.
It is. I still, it hasn't really quite sunk in, actually. I think because obviously all the bookshops are still shut in Scotland at the moment, so it still feels quite abstract. But no, it's fantastic. It's unbelievable.
How did you feel when you found out that the book had been shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize?
I was really, really thrilled, actually. It feels very special. It's a prize I really love and revere, actually. And I mean, wow, what a shortlist. It's a fantastic shortlist. And it's been given me, because there are some books on it that I've already read, the Kate Grenville and Hilary Mantel, but actually I've been working my way through the rest of the shortlist, and I'm now currently reading Dictionary of Lost Words. So, but it's a prize. I think actually I've read every single winner since the prize started. So it's something I always seek out. I think it's, I always think that prizes are actually for readers, not necessarily for writers, because it just recommends books that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have picked up.
It's hard to know what to read, and I think prizes are always a great. We have a lot of people telling us they make their way through our entire long list as well as a short list.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
For people who aren't familiar with the book or they haven't read it yet, could you just tell us a bit about who the person Hamnet was and why did you want to write a book about him?
So I first heard about Hamlet Shakespeare, the existence of William Shakespeare's only son, when I was studying the play Hamlet for my Scottish Highers in North Berwick in East Lothian, where you are currently calling from. And my teacher just mentioned in passing that Shakespeare had a son who was called Hamnet, and he had died aged 11. And Shakespeare had gone on about 4 or 5 years later to write the play Hamlet. And, the strange almost echo of these names really struck me, and I've just ever since then have been always intrigued by the link between the death of this child at aged 11, his very short and tragic life, and the writing of, I think anyway, Shakespeare's greatest play. So I wanted to write a novel because I feel that Hamlet, Shakespeare, the boy, has never been given his due. He's been consigned to a literary footnote. History has largely overlooked him, but I wanted to bring him back to center stage and give him a voice and a presence and say, this child was important. If we hadn't had him, without his very tragic death, we wouldn't have Hamlet, and we probably wouldn't have Twelfth Night.
And what does it mean that he named the play and the protagonist after his late son? How did his wife feel about that? How could he do that? Would that have been controversial? People don't perhaps think much of, Agnes, the wife of William Shakespeare, but that became quite a focus in the book, didn't it? Was that intentional, or did that just emerge organically when you sat down to write Hamnet's story?
Well, that was a bit of a surprise, because I'd always planned to write a novel about fathers and sons and ghosts and absence, as of course the play is. But actually I became slightly sidetracked in a sense about how badly I feel the woman who Shakespeare married has been treated. I feel that she, we know so little about Shakespeare. We only have 6 examples of his signature. And there are so many gaps in his story, so many things about him that we don't know, which have been, despite the best efforts of the world's greatest Shakespeareans and scholars. But actually, we know even less about his wife. We know roughly when she was born. We don't know exactly when she was born. She was born before records began. We know when they got married. We know that she had a baby 6 months later. But that's pretty much it, actually. But this hasn't stopped historians and scholars and other novelists and writers of Oscar-winning screenplays to rush forward to fill those gaps with actually just opprobrium and hostility and criticism. And, we're always taught this one very clear narrative about her, and only one, that she was this older strumpet who lured this boy genius into marriage, that he hated her, that he regretted marrying her, that he had to run away from London to get away from her. All of which I think is total and absolute rubbish. I've never been able to find a single shred of evidence, and people will always invoke the famous second best spared behest in Shakespeare's will, and say, this shows that he doesn't show any affection for her. But actually, if you look at the will itself, The second best bed is an interlineation. It's squeezed in between two other lines. And actually, the will is a very dry document. It doesn't show any affection for anybody. I mean, to be fair, he was dying, probably of typhoid, which is a particularly unpleasant death. So, I mean, and also what her detractors never mention is that by Jacobean law, a widow was entitled to a third of her husband's estate and to stay in the house where she lived. And they, at that point, were living in an absolute mansion of a place. So this idea that she was cast out on the street with just a bed to her name, this sort of hated, discarded wife, is absolute rubbish, and it's outdated.
How does this stuff become canon? How does this stuff become the truth? Because it just, acquires its own reality. But as you say, it's not there in the documents to prove that. It's just what someone decided, and then it becomes true.
I don't know. I could never really work out why it is that people have been so determined to give Shakespeare a retrospective divorce. Why it is we desire him to be footloose and fancy free. I don't know, because I think the evidence points to him really loving her. When he retired from the stage, he was very successful, incredibly wealthy, the equivalent of multimillionaire. He could have set up house, could have spent his retirement anywhere he wanted, but he chose to go back to Stratford to be with her, which to me does not speak of a man who hated his wife and regretted his marriage.
When we go back to look at the historical record, then when you want to write this story about Hamnet, you are researching it. How does one find the original sources to write the story? How did you manage to go about it and draw such a fantastic portrait of Agnès when you had so little to go on? What things did you put together?
Well, I mean, it was, for Shakespeare himself, there's no shortage of books written about him. And there is also, there are certain documents pertaining to him, not very many. There's an awful lot of documents about his father. His father got into all kinds of legal wrangles. So he left quite a big paper trail on Shakespeare. But in terms of Agnes, I mean, her name itself, I should probably say, came from her father's will. So her father, Richard Hathaway, died a year before she married William. Obviously we all know her as Anne Hathaway. I don't know why, because her name was Shakespeare for most of her life. But so Richard Hathaway left her a very generous dowry in his will. But in his will, he named her as my daughter Agnes, which was such a shock to me because I've never heard that name before in connection to her. And I thought, well, if anyone is going to know her real name, surely it's going to be her father. And it just seemed emblematic to me, of her treatment in the last, 400 odd years, that we've probably been calling her by the wrong name all this time. So I wanted to give that name back to her as a kind of signal to readers to say, I want you to forget everything you think you know about Anne Hathaway, and I want you to meet somebody new. This is a new interpretation. They loved each other. Their marriage was a partnership. And here is a woman you haven't met. This is Agnes.
I totally loved Agnes from the first moment we see her, when we go back in time to see William Shakespeare when he meets her. And of course, Shakespeare himself is never named in the book. That's something incredibly intriguing about the book. If you're reading it, you see that he's referred to as, the Latin tutor or her husband. And I thought you handled that so well, because as a supernova of a personality, he could have easily wiped all the other characters off the screen. But how did you balance that to allow, Shakespeare to be present in the book and still be very much himself with the wordplay and the puns and not, outshine the other characters?
Well, I always knew he wasn't going to be the main character because I wanted to put Hamnet center stage and also his mother, because actually for most of the action of the novel, Shakespeare wasn't actually there. He was in London. We know that there are documents and playbills to prove that he was working in London, as quite a lot of men did, from Warwickshire. So I knew that I wanted to bring Hamlet center stage. That was always the engine for me behind the book. But in terms of his name, I found that I couldn't write a sentence of fiction with the name William Shakespeare in it without getting really distracted. I couldn't write William Shakespeare walked up the path and knocked on the door. I felt like an Egypt. Mm-hmm. So I thought I was going to have to take it. And also, for me, the book is largely about names. It's very concerned with names, our connection with them, and how they can become disconnected from us, like Anne and Agnes and Hamlet, which is so very similar to Hamlet. And also, names, I think in Elizabethan times were very unstable. Spelling was unstable. Shakespeare in the 6 examples of his signature spelt it differently every single time, sometimes with an A, sometimes without, sometimes with an X. So it is a kind of confusing concept, I think, in those days. So I just thought I would take his name away because, like you say, it's a supernova of a name. It carries too much weight, too much significance. It's distracting for the writer, me, and any reader, I suspect. So I wanted readers, I think, to see him as a human being, as a person, rather than this literary behemoth.
I I loved the first sight that we have of Agnes when she is, coming out of the woods, and she has a kestrel on her arm, and he thinks at first, does he think at first that she's some crazy person, what does he think she's a man, or what is his first impression of her?
He thinks she's the kind of cousin to the farm, but he thinks she's a young man because she has her skirts up because she's been in the forest with her kestrel. Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, but I think what's always intrigued me about Shakespeare, me among many others, is that he shows such an enormous range of knowledge, in his plays and in his metaphors and poetry. And there's quite a lot of hawking metaphors in his plays, particularly Hamlet and also Taming of the Shrew, about relationships between men and women. So I just thought I like the idea that their marriage being an exchange of artistry and information. I like the idea that he maybe got this information from her. So that's why I gave her a kestrel. But I actually came down to the Scottish borders to learn to fly a kestrel while I was writing the book, which was actually the most fun thing I've ever done in the name of research. So I went to a wood and I met this very cool falconer, and she let me fly her kestrel, which was, it was so wonderful. I would really like a kestrel now, but I'm not sure whether I could keep one in Edinburgh.
You can tell from your description of the kestrel that you have been up close and personal with them, with the jingling and the hood and all that stuff, that you can really feel it and how it feels to be in the presence of this bird. The other thing that I loved is that when we see Agnes and the Latin tutor being together, you can see that it is a marriage of equals. And he says, that is why I love you, because you look at the world the way no one else does. And I love that you have rehabilitated her away from this, unhelpful pencil sketch that we have of Anne Hathaway into somebody who is very significant. Can you tell people who might not be familiar with it about this trick that she has when she holds hands with people? Because that was one of my favorite things about her.
Well, the other thing about her is she has this slight, I don't know if you call it intuition or very strong insight into people. And I actually can't remember why I decided that if she holds people's hand, a certain muscle between people's finger, you can see it here, this pincer muscle, which is actually very strong. And if she touches this, she can find out what people want and what they want to hold and what they have held in their hand. And I think partly the inspiration for that came from the plays themselves, actually, because there's an awful lot of prophecy and intuition and insight and superstition, whatever you want to call it. It's the second sight in Shakespeare's plays, the witches and Macbeth, or the prophecy, the Ides of March and Julius Caesar. So, and also I think it was important to respect and regard the fact that in those days, people were much more closely tied to nature and supernature. There was an awful lot more of superstition as well as religion. So I wanted to honor that. I think, if you are writing about the past, you can't impose too much of your modern sensibilities on it. You've got to allow their beliefs to breathe and be respected.
I wondered if you would like to do a little reading for us.
Yeah.
If you want to get your book open there, I will just give you the stage for a moment. Okay. This is Maggie O'Farrell reading from Hamnet.
The room is filled with gloom, coverings pulled over most of the windows. His grandfather is standing with his back to him in a crouched position, fumbling with something, papers, a cloth bag, counters of some sort. Hamnet gives a polite cough. His grandfather wheels around, his face wild, furious. "Who's there?" he cries. "It's me, Hamnet." His grandfather sits down with a thud. "You scared the wits out of me, boy," he cries. "Whatever do you mean, creeping about like that?" "I'm sorry," Hamnet says. "I was calling and calling, but no one answered. Judith is unwell, and—" "Do you know where they've gone?" Hamnet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, still mopping at his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamlet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. "Don't stand there gawping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamlet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling in his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he's in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand well clear of him. His father had said this to him on his last visit, when they had been helping unload a cart from the tannery. John, his grandfather, had dropped a bundle of skins into the mud and in a sudden fit of temper had hurled a paring knife at the wall. His father had immediately pulled Hamlet back behind him out of the way, but John had barged past them into the house without a word. His father had taken Hamlet's face in both of his hands, fingers curled in at the nape of his neck, his gaze steady and searching. "He'll not touch your sisters, but it's you I worry for. he had muttered, his brow puckering. You know the humour I mean, don't you? Hamlet had nodded, but wanted the moment to be prolonged, for his father to keep holding his head like that. It gave him the sensation of lightness, of safety, of being entirely known and treasured. Swear to me, his father had said, as they stood in the yard, his voice hoarse. Swear it. I need to know you'll be safe when I'm not here to see to it. Thank you.
I love that reading, and that's one of the moments where we see Hamnet with his father, and his father is of course away a lot, and it's such a tender moment. I had no idea, and as you said, there's quite a paper trail to show that John, Shakespeare's father, had been in so much trouble and doing dodgy dealings, dodgy glove maker. Tell us a bit about that.
So William's father, John Shakespeare, was one of the most successful glove makers in Stratford-upon-Avon. I mean, to be very fair to my depiction of him, he could have been a very lovely man. I don't know. He could have been the life and soul of the party. But when I was studying the documents about him, about the time William and Agnes got married, their family fortunes had taken a huge dive for the worse. So John had been a high alderman in Stratford-upon-Avon. He'd inhabited this very important civic role. It was a little bit like being Lord Mayor. But he had started illegally trading in wool and got himself into all kinds of debt and trouble. And he was summoned to court for not attending church. He was fined for dumping what was described as ordure in the street outside their house on Henley Street. I mean, I think we don't even need to go into what that was. But it's just all very strange. And I think he was hugely in debt to everyone around, a lot of people around town. So I read an account saying that he very rarely left the house because he was so worried about running into his creditors. So I just got the impression of this quite erratic personality. And also I was wondering where the kind of this sort of slightly aggressive, ambitious men, violent men also in Shakespeare's plays come from, the kind of men whose ambition is their downfall. So thinking of Hamnet or Coriolanus or Titus Andronicus. And I merged that interpretation with the person I could find in the documents and with the person I found in Shakespeare's plays, because I thought they have to come from somewhere.
I'm by no means a Shakespeare scholar, but I'm very familiar with a few of the plays. And it felt to me, reading Hamnet, that you are looking at the raw material that fed into his characters, as you say, the witchiness, the deluded men, the loyal siblings. You mentioned Twelfth Night, which focuses on the twins, of course. The relationship between Hamnet and his twin sister Judith is so touching. And Judith, of course, as you say, went on to live quite a long life, didn't she?
She did. She lived until her early 70s, which in those days was extraordinary, when the life expectancy was 48. I don't get the feeling that her life was terribly happy, unfortunately. She had 3 sons, all of whom she had to bury, one at age 2 and the others age 20 and 21 within a week of each other. And she had a husband who was named as the father of another woman's child. So I almost can't bear it, actually, the thought of Judith's continuing life. I mean, she lived a long life, it's sure, but I think she had an awful lot to contend with, unfortunately.
As I know that you know, the Walter Scott Prize has a younger sibling, which is the Young Walter Scott Prize for young writers 11 to 19. And I know that they would love to get a single piece of advice from you if they would like to write stories that are set in a time before they were born. How should they go about that?
I would say, I think the thing that I wish I'd known when I started writing is that you don't have to begin at the beginning. Beginnings are hard. It's hard to kind of set out your stall and find the perfect first line. So I would say just write. It doesn't matter. You can start in the middle, you can start at the end. Just put down words and try and inhabit as much as you can your character. And don't worry too much about details. You can do the research as you go along. You know, what you need to know will be revealed to you in the act of writing. So just get the words down on paper and worry about all the details later.
We have a number of people asking questions here. For all of you watching, if you do have any questions for Maggie, please do let us know, and we will ask her as many as we can in the time allowed. We have a question from Louise Kelly asking, do you take inspiration from other writers, from other genres, other media?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a huge reader, actually. I'm a terrible insomniac, which, of course, has lots of downsides, well documented. But the upside is that you get an awful lot of reading time. So I do read as much as I can, pretty omnivorously all the time. And I think there's a huge amount you can learn from books that you love, but also books that you don't necessarily love. You know, you can always think about why a book isn't working or why a book is so brilliant. You've got to be a bit like a mechanic lifting up the bonnet of a car and thinking, how does this beautifully oiled machine work?
Has the pandemic made your insomnia better or worse? Has it affected your writing or, your sleeping?
I mean, what I found actually with reading, certainly during the pandemic, I've really wanted to go back and reread book series. It's quite interesting. I've gone back and I've wanted to read the Casalets, and I wanted to read Jane Gardam's Old Filth trilogy again, and the Barrytown trilogy, and and I've actually gone back and read Waverley, Walter Scott. Because I think I'm so thrilled. Actually, I live in a city, Edinburgh, which I think is the only city in the world that has named its railway station after a novel. I love that detail.
And the Scott Monument, 200 feet high, I think it's the world's largest monument anywhere to a writer. How wonderful to have that right near your home.
It's so exciting. And actually, that was the place that I used to meet my friends when I was a teenager. I used to get the train up from North Berwick, and it was always on the steps of the Scott Monument that I used to hang out with my friends. So in that way, I'm also grateful to Walter Scott.
It's his 250th birthday this year. Did his writing have an effect on your own development as a novelist?
Absolutely. I read Waverley at school, and we were encouraged to read a lot of his poetry. It was very important, especially, in Scottish education. He is kind of up there. And I think in more recent years, I've realized gradually that actually he was one of the first people that gave authority and dignity to folkloric tales. I think he was probably the first person to actually gather those tales. I mean, I suppose they're the Grimm's brothers who collected Eastern European fairy tales, but in a sense, he's the one who honoured and dignified Scottish folklore, which again, I think it can be interpreted as a kind of feminist act, if we are imposing, modern, because I think the folkloric sort of oral tradition was very much a female domain. And I think him taking it and dignifying it is a very exciting act, actually. And it's also preserved a lot of them for us today.
And as for his historical fiction, as for the whole idea of historical fiction, his pioneering of the genre, do you think the historical fiction and the books that you write, can they help us deal with the present and think about the future as well as looking back?
I do. I mean, I think what Scott did, I think I'm right in saying that he was the first person to insert a fictional character into a real life historical situation. That, in the case of his books, the Jacobean Rebellion, and I think that again, that's such an incredible motif that to this day, as you know, from my writing and say Hilary Mantel's writing, that exists to this day, doesn't it? It was something that he invented, that he began, and I think there is a sense that I think we are often drawn to read historical novels or write historical fiction to try and make sense of our present. It's only by going back into the past and looking at it with new eyes through the eyes of a fictional character that we can understand where we are today and who we are today. Reading
Hamnet, I in addition to Hamnet and Judith being ill in the book, it reminds me of how close death always was in Elizabethan times. Obviously, you wrote this far before the pandemic, but we live in a pretty healthy age. But when they were living, it would have infant mortality must have been very high. What was life expectancy?
Life expectancy was 48 on average, particularly in a rural area like Stratford. And so I'm 48, so I would have been a very, very old crone in those days, which in some ways I quite like the idea of, but I mean, obviously that's appallingly young to us. And certainly infant mortality was heartbreaking. The statistics, I could almost bear to read them. I think it was 1 in 5 children died before they were 5, which is, Shakespeare himself had 2 older sisters who died, one as a baby and one aged almost 2. So the summer that he was born in as April, because actually today is his baptismal day. In June, there is in the June of his birth year, there is an entry in the parish register that says "Hic incipit pestis," here begins plague. And in that outbreak, about a third of the population of Stratford-upon-Avon died. And when I read that, I was just thinking about his mother, Mary Shakespeare, and how she must have felt that summer. She'd buried 2 daughters. She had this tiny 6-week-old baby, and there was a couple of doors down. There was a whole family of 4 that died on their street, on Henley Street. And you just think about that one tiny little life and that one tiny detail and how terrified she must have been that summer.
And losing a child at any age, losing a family member, at any time in history is a tragedy, and you bring that forward so beautifully at Hamnet's death. This image of Agnes holding on to the post in the cemetery and thinking, if I don't leave this spot, I'm still close to him. I can't bear to move from this place. How, as a writer, can you bear to kind of plumb those depths of grief and not lose yourself?
I mean, I'm not going to lie and say that writing those scenes were easy, because they weren't. They were very hard, not in a technical sense, but just in the place you had to go to. I knew that I was going to have to put myself inside the skin of a woman who is forced to sit at her child's bedside and watch him die. But in a way, the impetus and the engine behind the book for me was to amplify Hamlet's death. I feel that he's been overlooked by scholars in history, and I wanted to say this child was important. In every biography I read pretty much of Shakespeare, the mention, which is so brief, of Hamlet's death was always wrapped up in those statistics of child mortality, almost as and I've read very respected scholars saying, it's impossible to it's impossible to really appreciate how his death affected Shakespeare. And I want to kind of shake these books and say, are you joking? Obviously, I just refuse to believe at any point anywhere in history, at any point in time, anywhere in the world, that it was anything more than absolutely catastrophic to lose a child. So that's why I wanted the readers to grieve, in a sense, with the Shakespeares, because I wanted to say, of course he was grieved. You only have to read the opening scenes of the play, excuse me, to understand that this whole play is about grief. It's about loss. The whole play is a message from a father in one world to an unreachable son in another.
We have another question here from a Queen's Park Book Festival. They want to know, is it secret, or are you allowed to talk about anything you're working on now?
Oh, well, unfortunately, I can't. I can say it's another historical novel. That's about all I can say. But I'm very wary about talking about books I haven't finished yet. I'm almost finished. I'm about, I don't know what you'd say, 7/8 of the way through a first draft of something. And I'm loving it, actually. So hopefully it'll be finished soon.
Rebecca asks, do you find it more liberating to write fiction set in the past or the present?
I don't know. It's interesting. I think all books are so different. And I think what I found that, obviously that with Hamlet, the thing that I had to get over, the biggest hurdle I had to get over, was the idea of writing about Shakespeare. And once you because he is who he is. But actually the past, and I think in a way, I really love the research, in a way, I find, but you have to think carefully about how much you put in. I think there's so much you need to know in order to create a scene in, say, an Elizabethan parlor, but you have to leave out 95% of it, because I really don't like the kind of historical fiction that feels very weighed down with all the important research that the author has done. I think I always feel that the advice about historical novels should be the opposite to what your maths teachers always says, which was show your workings. Historical fiction shouldn't show, novelists shouldn't show their workings. We don't want to know that you've done all your homework. We just need to know, we need to feel like confident that you have. So kind of the novels that I really enjoy are the ones that wear their history lightly, in a sense.
The thing that I thought I loved this book, and what I thought you did so beautifully was, and which can be alienating sometimes, is when we go in and out of the minds of various characters, but it's so seamless. And it nearly reminded me of what Agnes can do when she touches people. She goes right down into the depths of them, and you almost give me that same sensation when we go into the heads of the different characters, but it flows so beautifully. I just thought you did that perfectly well.
Well, thank you very much, Sheila. That's very nice. And I think I wanted it to be about all the inhabitants of that particular house on Henley Street. So it was important that it was a kind of polyphonic novel.
Can I say that Susana was one of my favorite ones? Maybe because there's a teenage girl in my house, but that she was just tired of her mom being kind of weird and being kind of, can't you just be normal? I love that.
Oh, that's nice. I really enjoyed writing about Susana. I like the idea that I don't know, just the kind of irreverence of teenagers. I have a teenager too, so just the idea that they kind of look at their parents with such a kind of steely eye sometimes. Yes.
We have time for just a couple more questions. I wanted to ask you if the way that we see John in in the novel. I know you said, he could have been a perfectly nice guy, but when you were researching and you found out some of the facts about him, did any of that shock you? Was that your biggest surprise, or were there other surprises in your research that you said, oh my gosh, I can't believe this, nobody's told me this?
So many, honestly. I mean, actually, my children limited me while I was writing Hamlet. My children limited me to only one Tudor fact a day, and that was at dinner time. And I was only allowed to say one, because otherwise I would kind of say, "You'll never guess what I found out today. You'll never guess. You'll never guess." I think the thing that there were two things that really surprised me. My favorite ever Tudor fact is that Tudor sheep were half the size of the sheep we'd have today, which just thrilled me, because I really want a Tudor sheep. Imagine how tiny they were, so cute. And also, the thing that really struck me was very, very, very early on, before I'd even probably written a word, I'd always assumed vaguely that Shakespeare got some kind of carriage or coach to London from Stratford. But actually, those things didn't exist in the 16th century. So he would have walked, which took about 4 days. And I remember that being a kind of real moment, because I just thought, okay, I am dealing with a world that is so unfamiliar to me. It's so different. This is going to be a big job. But I was excited by that, I think.
It's wonderful. You must have this massive wealth of Tudor facts now that you're going to have like write a little book of Tudor fun facts that your kids wouldn't let you mention at the table.
No, I wouldn't be allowed.
Well, tragically, we are out of time now. I wanted to say thank you to all the people who are watching us live. If you want to find out more about Maggie's work, please go to her website, to maggieofarrell.com. If you want to find out more about future Walter Scott Prize Shortlist Spotlights, please follow the hashtag Walter Scott Prize, or go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. That is the best way to find out what we're doing next. And what we are doing next is speaking with author Pip Williams. She is the author of this fantastic book, The Dictionary of Lost Words. That's going to be in the 9th of May. This is about the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary and the women's words and the women who have been forgotten. So tune into that one. Maggie, thank you again so much for joining us.
That's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Have a nice evening, everybody.
Too. Thank you all for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.